Okay, awesome.
Awesome. So first things first, we want to start off with a formal land acknowledgement. So tonight we're going to talk a lot about law and legality, environmental justice, race, and generally just about living in this world. And all of these things, unsurprisingly, are intrinsically tied to the land, which is in turn bound up with people who have lived on and with it for generations. Here at Dartmouth, for students who are on campus or folks who have been to campus, Dartmouth is on what remains to be, to this day, ancestral, unceded Abenaki land. This is a tenuous acknowledgement that we should sit uncomfortably with and keep with us throughout this discussion tonight. And even then, recognizing that, words are only so much, and land acknowledgement goes beyond, just recognizing where we are, but recognizing, what that means to be settlers on this land. We're going to drop a few links in the chat with resources to learn more, and a few that are useful for monetary reparations if that interests you. Alisa, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And thank you so much to all of the organizers for your time and energy and labor on this. I really want to acknowledge Dahlia and Jasmine, Rachel, and everyone else involved. And yeah, so I'm calling in today from the town of Jackson, Wyoming. And this town occupies Shoshone, Bannock, Eastern Shoshone, and Cheyenne land. And as a law student and a white woman, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how white people wielding the laws of the United States have stripped Indigenous people of their land, and specifically in the area where I'm calling in from right now, of hunting and fishing rights. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how back in the 1890s, there was a case called Ward versus Racehorse, where, and this was brought by the impetus of white settlers in the Jackson area, who arrested local Shoshone Bannock people for hunting elk in a way that they claimed was illegal. And this was a case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it found that the state of Wyoming is allowed to basically violate treaty rights for the Shoshone Bannock people and restrict their hunting, even though they were granted in a treaty in 1863 hunting rights to elk all across through large swaths of what is now Wyoming and Idaho. And this case was not overturned until 2019, so that's over 100 years of hunting rights being restricted. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that and position myself as a white law student, realizing how much violence and harm the law has done to, and white people wielding the law has done to Indigenous folks. And I'm going to post a couple links as well to Native-led legal organizations that work on supporting Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty, and work for tribal nations in the United States, in case people want to donate, because they're both nonprofit legal orgs. So I'll start with that, but I'll hand it back over to Dahlia and Jasmine and Rachel.
Awesome, thank you. So I think that's really important to kind of begin with that and set the tone and set the space for what we're doing here today. But from there, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to
Jasmine, you're freezing up.
A little bit more like reading out a couple of hours, and then we'll get moving. Might be one of those days, but can you all hear me now?
Yes,
I can hear you.
Okay, maybe one of those moments we'll have to camera off for a bit. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and proceed with Alisa's bio. That's okay with everybody? Perfect. And just, putting that out there, we all know we're in very different places and with very different levels of internet access. So letting everybody know to be patient with everyone today. But yeah, so Alisa White is a joint Juris Doctor and Master of Environmental Science candidate at Yale Law School and Yale School of the Environment. Alisa is one of the co-founders of Law Students for Climate Accountability, LSCA, which is a law student-run effort to hold the legal industry accountable for its role in the climate crisis. At Yale, Alisa is a Carey Fellow, a co-chair of the Yale Environmental Law Association, and a submissions editor for the Yale Journal of International Law, advocating for clean air for all and the legal right to a stable climate. She's had legal internships at the Environmental Defense Fund and Our Children's Trust. Prior to law school, Alisa graduated from Dartmouth College in 2017, so she's at 17, and she worked in environmental consulting and conducted research on community-based forest management in the United States, Mexico, and Ecuador. So obviously she's done many, many amazing things already, and she hasn't even finished law school. So we're really, really grateful to have you here today talking with us.
Yeah, and I can ask her the first question if you'd like, Jasmine. So we have a couple of questions for her, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience. But our first question is, what are some ways that your Dartmouth experience influenced your interest in environmental justice, law, and everything else that Jasmine mentioned in your bio? And along with that, like knowing that you were an EMBS major, you went on FSP. Did you feel like you gained a lot from those experiences in terms of just like EJ and law? And have you used any of the things that you've learned within those experiences in your career now and in law school now?
Yeah, so I think kind of the first framing of this is that I grew up in a pretty small town in upstate New York, which is a predominantly white space, very much so. And I think coming to Dartmouth for me was meeting people from across the country as well as from across the world, of different people of different, race and ethnicity backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so for me, that was a very something that was very formative about my time at Dartmouth, as well as afterwards, is just meeting more people who've had different lived experiences than I have of environmental issues, as well as, other racial justice, climate justice, all of that intersecting. So with that as background, I think some of the main experience that I had at Dartmouth that shaped my interest in environmental justice and law. I think first, my sophomore winter on an off term, I went to work for an NGO in Ecuador called Fundación Runa, now called Fundación Aliados. And I think the D plan was really cool in that respect, because I was actually the only intern there at the time, because it was, the winter when there's not really a lot of students off. So I got to work like very much directly with communities that the NGO supports, researching agroforestry projects, as well as supporting fair trade certification, and basically just like part of the time living in a community and talking to people about their goals for their land, like asking people questions, listening to people's stories about illegal logging done by companies. So in Ecuador, there's a lot of illegal logging that goes on led by companies, as well as land tenure issues where the government basically doesn't recognize indigenous land tenure. So I think that first experience working with communities, now the terminology that I know is like frontline communities, like communities that are grappling with climate change, with land rights being taken away from them, with indigenous sovereignty, and facing, against corporate actors and government actors. I've kind of reflected and realized now that experience was really formative to me, realizing how climate justice intersects with indigeneity and race, as well as, fighting against government and corporate actors that perpetuate climate injustice against BIPOC communities. So I think that was really formative, as well as the environmental studies, the ENVS FSP. I spent time researching land rights and in post-apartheid South Africa, and the different community conservation outcomes when communities have received their land rights, have been given back to them, or their land from after the government appropriated it. So that was kind of my first experience seeing how a law in post-apartheid South Africa shaped land reclamation and indigenous people being able to reclaim their land, and just talking to people while I was there, and doing interviews and researching what people's experience, kind of their lived experience with these laws. And to me, that made me realize that I wanted to pursue law further, and basically to seeing how law can shape people's lives and shape people's environments, and also, wanting to support indigenous communities that are fighting back against unjust laws also, and trying to reform laws that don't work for the interests of indigenous people. And so, I think those are two formative experiences. And then I wanted to give a shout out to, I think he might be in the audience today, or he was for a moment, Professor Howarth was my thesis advisor. And And so I wanted to give him a shout out because I think the experience of doing a thesis on, I looked at community-based forest management in Vermont and carbon credits. And I interviewed a lot of different landowners. And I think that also gave me insight into the class intersection with environmental justice, in the sense of a lot of carbon credit and carbon offsets programs don't benefit small scale landowners who already are facing pressure to deforest their land, and are not high income. So I think those are three pretty formative experiences. I did want to shout out the thesis process and being able to spend a whole kind of year and a half working on a topic, and really delving into it.
That's really, really interesting. And I think something that was really salient about what you just mentioned, to me at least, was, this kind of first experience you were getting while you were an undergrad in working in environmental justice and really understanding law and legality and kind of the challenges it poses is really interesting, especially to have that experience in undergrad, because it's not only was it a learning experience for you, but it wasn't just that kind of thing where you're just going and learning and benefiting from kind of the issues that are happening in places, but you were able, to start making a difference or helping that organization so early and helping them, carry out their mission, which I think is really, really impactful. But going off of that, I think you talked about undergraduate being kind of your introduction to environmental justice, and the first time you thought about environmental issues from these angles. So it'd be interesting to know, how have you continued to learn about and work on, EJ issues beyond undergrad? Where have those opportunities continued, or some ways that you're involved in kind of that learning and work outside of law school?
Yeah. And I would emphasize, trying to get involved in environmental justice in a lot of different ways too. And I think for me, off terms and the FSP were really formative, but also there's a lot of activism and other ways, to get involved during undergrad. But since then, I think, I'll just give a couple examples, because I feel like I've tried to shape kind of all of the work and like a lot of what I spend my time on environmental justice. And I think one example outside of law school is after doing environmental consulting for a year and a half, I applied for one of the Dartmouth has postgraduate fellowships, which, plug for those. I feel like they're not kind of like advertised enough on campus, but I applied for fellowship funding from Dartmouth to work with a local NGO in Oaxaca, Mexico, to work on support community-based forest monitoring. And a term that I was reading about recently, about data sovereignty, which is that indigenous communities oftentimes, even for example, in Mexico, Mexico has payment for ecosystem service programs that they run through the national government. But what often happens is, for example, like what they call a technical expert from the government will come in and take all this data on the forest and then leave with it. It's not shared with the communities, and communities aren't necessarily involved in generating the data. So part of what I was working on with the local NGO based in Oaxaca is supporting community-based trainings on how to generate scientific tree measurement and forest monitoring data, so that data stays with the community and that the community gets to decide what they use their data for, rather than it kind of like being extracted from them through a national program. So that's one example, being involved outside of law school. I would definitely, I think that experience working in Mexico was really formative to me. And I think very much addressed, I think this is your next question about consulting. But I think for me, something that was tough about environmental consulting is that the group that I was working for was doing really cool analyses of the impacts of climate change. And there were justice elements. Like, for example, we did analyses about air pollution, and acknowledging how air pollution affects Black communities and communities of color even more so than white communities. So I did get to do some work that intersected with environmental justice, but it wasn't really as focused on that. And I think that experience in consulting drove me to say, I want to be doing environmental justice work. I want to be doing work that's focused on Indigenous sovereignty on a daily basis. I want to do more than climate change analyses, although those are really important, and I enjoyed doing that quantitative work. I think it very much inspired me to pursue the legal career and pursue a career where I, spend my everyday working on environmental justice issues. So that's just one example there.
Yeah, awesome. I think a lot of what you're mentioning is bringing up even more questions for me. So I just want to put it out there in case this is the same for other folks, as we forgot to mention before, but please submit questions through the question and answer feature. And we'll definitely have time towards the end to answer any audience questions. So just wanted to put that out there. But yeah, that's really interesting. How you kind of talk through, you were able to do environmental justice work kind of adjacently to your role, but it wasn't really the focus. So something I'm really interested in is, what was your process of going about realizing, okay, well, this isn't environmental justice enough. Well, how do I align, my work with that interest? So were you already interested in law? Did you kind of just realize that was the way to kind of do this goal you had of working on those issues every day, like in your daily work? So yeah, any you think you can offer about kind of that process?
Yeah, and it's definitely I think also it's a note on just the evolving, just kind of allowing yourself to evolve as your interests and kind of your goals and your experiences change, right? It's kind of like letting the experiences that you have in life shape you. And I think for me, spending time on environmental justice work at Dartmouth is something that shaped me, and what realizing that whatever I could do to contribute, I wanted to give support to Indigenous communities. And so I definitely, a plug for, letting your experiences shape you. And I think for environmental consulting, I started to realize as I was, first of all, who our clients were. So I worked at the company that I worked for. Our clients were people like the World Bank. I guess not people, organizations like the World Bank, the EPA, State Department. And we were doing the work we were doing was looking at the impact of climate change on a variety of different, we were looking at, for example, like the impact of climate change on flooding in various parts of India, on sea level rise in Vietnam. So, but the clients were government entities. And like I said, I think, there's different types of work works well for different people, but I really felt like I just started to feel, I found myself thinking about like, what is it, what are communities living in this area of Vietnam thinking? What are communities living in this region of India thinking about flooding, and about like what is my work actually supporting these communities, and is my work supporting their priorities and their goals? And I didn't really feel like I could answer that question. Yes, maybe more indirectly it does, but I think I wanted to be doing work where I was asking communities, what are your goals, and like is there a way that I can leverage the privilege and the resources I have to support those goals? And to me, going to law school, and also I'm doing the dual master's degree in part so that I can pursue policy as well, to focus both on not just the litigation and the lawsuits, but also focusing on working on new laws and new policies. So I think for me, it seemed like a better pathway to have a career focused on listening to frontline communities and listening to the priorities, and then leveraging the privilege of going to law school, the privilege of going to Dartmouth, and leveraging all those connections and privileges to support communities. So I think for me, I realized consulting was answering a lot of questions, and it plays a role in addressing the climate crisis and climate injustice. But kind of at the end of the day, it's community organizing, it's law, and it's policy that really shapes change and what happens going forward. So I think those are some of the things I started to realize the more time I spent working. And then, like I said, I think it was a good experience because I am like kind of a data nerd too. Like I love a good map and like visualizing data in a way that like brings new light to a problem. So I hope to keep using those skills throughout kind of my career and my life. But I think law and policy to me was a way to be affecting change, as well as to translate to help support community goals and priorities more directly.
That's awesome. And I think it leads nicely into our next question, right? We talked a little bit about your interest and the kind of law you want to go into, and just I guess like our next question is like, why public interest law? And in what ways did you see law being useful for furthering environmental justice, Indigenous rights work, etc.? But also, how do you find it to be limiting when it comes to thinking about these things in the framework of just law?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely a great question to ask too. as I'm in the midst of, I'm finishing, or I'm entering my second semester of my second year of law school. So I've really been, and then next year I get to spend a full year doing policy work for my master's. So I'm very excited to do some policy work. I think because I'll kind of start with some of the, well, I guess I'll start with the public interest law question and then transition into some of the limitations of law. So yeah, I think for me, I really knew going into law school, I wanted to do public interest. I think very much like tried to choose law schools that support public interest work, as well as offer kind of like fellowships and loan forgiveness for public interest work. And I think for me, it's just like public interest law part, you're able to use the power that you have to support community goals and priorities in a way that you're not as able to in the private sector, because you have that profit bottom line. So I think for me, it's kind of always been, I want to do public interest. I think I've considered there's some private law firms that sue corporations on behalf of like a class. For example, like if there's an oil spill which affects fishermen in the area, private law firms might sue the corporation for damages from that lawsuit, so that the fishermen can recover from like their lost income, for example. So I've thought about that, maybe doing that at some point, but I think public interest is very much where you get to, you get to provide support also to communities that might otherwise not have access to legal services because of the cost. So I think that's something that's very important to me too, is expanding access to the law to both to BIPOC communities, low-income communities, and yeah, so that's something I find that's very important to me. And yeah, in terms of the limitations of law, I think is that law school tends to focus pretty heavily on litigation, on lawsuits and that form of taking action. I've been able to kind of take more of the policy and legislation related classes because I think that ultimately, passing local and state laws, having communities be the ones drafting and putting their priorities into the law. And there's great organizations doing that work, supporting communities drafting laws and local ordinances, as well as federal laws. So I think, one of the main limitations of law is that sometimes current laws don't protect low-income communities, don't protect BIPOC communities. And I think it's there are a lot of compromises that go into passing a law. And then I think also there's issues with disparate enforcement, like even learning about how the EPA has failed to act on environmental justice and civil rights complaints for so many years. So I think there's both uneven enforcement in the law, as well as sometimes, there's like one of the most frustrating things for me, because I also look at public interest international law and look at, for example, the impacts of multinational corporations on indigenous communities abroad, and just seeing how companies have been able to evade responsibility for example, like a large oil spill in Ecuador done by Chevron. So oftentimes the law is not enough. And I think also sometimes the mentality in law school can be this kind of like top down, like we have all this knowledge. And I very much do not agree with that, as well as like, I think we, as law students, I try to work to destabilize that notion and say, no, maybe we've developed this expertise, but it's not up to us to decide like what are the priorities of an indigenous community. Like that is their like sovereignty and their rights. And if anything, what I would do is support what they've expressed are their goals and provide services as requested. So that kind of touches on a couple things of where the law isn't enough. I also just think we need community organizing to put pressure on lawmakers to enforce the laws. We need to put pressure on them to pass new laws. So I think I've very much, and I think with Law Students for Climate Accountability, which I think Jasmine mentioned in the bio, is a group that myself and some other of my peers formed. We published a report illustrating how much work the top law firms in the country do to support the fossil fuel industry, kind of on the order of billions of dollars worth of fossil fuel transactions, like pipelines per year. So yeah, the legal industry in many ways is complicit in the climate crisis. Not every aspect of the legal industry, but I think we have a lot of reckoning to do as future lawyers, and as the legal industry about climate change and climate justice and the role that we should be playing in supporting frontline communities. So anyway, I go on about that for days, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for answering that question. And I guess going along the same veins of like limitations, what are some barriers you face in your work, as you've mentioned, with like Indigenous rights issues, and what do you think are some solutions to those barriers, or how do you think we can overcome those barriers?
Yeah, so I think first, I think I would like call it a challenge, as well as just like, I think personally, like, have spent a lot of time interrogating my own, my own position as a white, like educated, relatively wealthy woman from the US, especially like living and working in Indigenous spaces in Mexico, for example. So I think rather than, I don't know if I'd phrase it as a barrier, but more so like, I think not spending enough time like kind of challenging one's role in that work can lead to a lot of issues. I think part of stuff that we see in like in foreign aid and foreign and NGOs coming in, and I think there were definitely a couple of Dartmouth classes I took that also like really emphasized this as well, about the flaws with international aid and with like predominantly white US NGOs kind of coming in and imposing their values and their thoughts on different regions of the world. So I think really consistently checking in with oneself and saying like, am I listening more than I'm speaking? Am I really focusing all that I'm doing around the expressed priorities and goals of communities? I'm not making assumptions. So I think that's always just a really important part of the work that I found myself doing, as well as, just like the personal side of the work. And then I think other barriers as well. I mean, I think just like the long history, at least in the United States, like a long history of violations of treaty rights, of lack of prior informed consent for treaties, like pressuring tribes to sign them, as well as just states usurping the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. So I think it's really, like just the barrier of like how much wrongdoing has been done, and how to, and essentially like how to reform laws and how to support Indigenous sovereignty when there's been so much. It's just, there's so many different layers of injustice, and really trying to figure out how to tackle. Sometimes it is just tackling like case by case or piece by piece. Like for example, this spring I'm working in a law school clinic, supporting a nonprofit that does legal organization. That's one of the big. They work with tribal nations in the U.S. and in Canada, and support their various lawsuits to support their sovereignty. So for me, that's like one example of saying, okay, me doing this legal work isn't fully addressing all of the issues all the way down and all of the injustices all the way down, but it's a way to work towards greater Indigenous sovereignty. So I think one challenge in the work is realizing that, they're just finding ways to support Indigenous communities and address the problem, but not coming into the work feeling like, oh, I'm going to solve all these problems, because that's not the approach to take. It's not coming in trying to like save people or anything like that. I think that's a very dangerous approach. And so I think, some of the barriers I faced, I think are just addressing personal, like how to be an effective ally and a part of the Indigenous rights and land back movement. And then I think just also, I think acknowledging around the world how land rights and environmental justice defenders face both suppression by the government, as well as are targeted for like being murdered as well. And I taking time to acknowledge that there are a lot of really powerful forces that don't support Indigenous rights, corporate forces, government forces, and don't support Indigenous rights and sovereignty, don't support environmental justice, and acknowledging that those are pretty intense barriers to overcome. But that's why we need movements, and that's why we need people working on this. So I'd be remiss to not address the insane corporate and government barriers that exist to supporting Indigenous rights. But I'll go with I'll stop there because again, these are fantastic questions that there's could spend whole days discussing each response, but I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you bring up a lot. You have really, really thoughtful and insightful answers, really thinking through what it means to kind of navigate these like workspaces where you kind of know that the confines that you have to work within are already kind of limited in a way, or already, particular to a certain way of doing things that you kind of recognize. It may not be the best way, but you're figuring out, how do you navigate that? How do you put your skills and your resources to best use for folks and communities who need it? I think I really enjoy hearing you talk about that, so candidly. And I think folks will really kind of appreciate that and benefit from that, because I feel like oftentimes, as students, we hear about careers, but we don't really know what it means to really navigate and make those hard decisions and to remain aligned with what you believe is kind of right, through doing that work. And again, that can begin to sound, really theoretical or up in the air, but I think hearing you talk, it's really interesting and helpful to see what it actually means to navigate what kind of work you're willing to do and what kind of work you're not willing to do, and what do you think is the most impactful. So going along those same lines, it'll be interesting to know what do you imagine your next steps to be after you finish law school and your master's degree. Are there any particular types of cases or law groups or things like that you can imagine yourself working on? This is going along, the lines for students and other people, interested people who are really interested in what does it look like to do this work on a regular. I feel like most people who grew up or like who have any concept of law, oftentimes it is corporate law or kind of private law and the things that you were discussing earlier. Not to cast that in one singular light, but it's really interesting to know, what does it mean to actually have a career dedicated to environmental justice, public interest law? Like that sounds like such a bit of buzzword, but what does that kind of work look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. So I think for me, I think that the ideal career would span both some of the litigation side, like filing lawsuits against companies, against government actors if they're harming the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous people. Both litigation as well as, like I was saying before, how sometimes the law, there aren't laws to address an injustice that's going on. So I think also supporting frontline communities to develop new policies and new laws, both, I think ideally for me, both in the United States and abroad. And so I guess to make that a little less, a little less broad, for example, I could see myself working, there's an organization, I'm doing an internship for them this summer called Earth Justice, and they do a lot of US-based litigation, as well as they support local litigation in other countries. So for example, they support litigation in litigation in South America and South Africa, focused on communities suing fossil fuel industries and communities suing coal power plants for polluting their communities, harming their health and well-being. So I think I could see myself working for an organization like Earth Justice, or offering support to, there are more, Earth Justice is partners with grassroots organizations. So I think either working as a partner to a grassroots organization, or working within them as working directly for an Indigenous rights or grassroots organization is something I could see myself doing. And another example, I think like the lawsuits can play a really important role in stopping harmful pipeline infrastructure. That's Earth Justice has brought a lot of the cases. I think they're supporting the Line 3 case right now, as well as lawsuits against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So I think there definitely is a role for lawyers to play in supporting tribal nations and Indigenous groups in stopping harmful fossil fuel infrastructure. So I definitely see myself doing that, as well as I hope to do more research and work with communities to develop, what would legislation look like in different countries to support Indigenous land rights. And I think that's a really broad topic, but ultimately there are a lot of different local groups and other nonprofit supporting local groups that are working on these type of issues. So part of that work would involve partnering directly with communities. And like I said, I think really approaching it from a listening perspective and listening to what are the goals of Indigenous communities, what action can we take under current law, and then in what ways do the laws need to change. So yeah, I think probably the nonprofit sector is where I hope to spend a lot of my time and my career. And I think right out of law school, I'll try to do some litigation while the skills are kind of the most fresh. And then I hope to transition into working on legislation to address land rights issues, Indigenous rights issues, And yeah, I'm hoping, I think I'd hope to focus work like in the Western Hemisphere. So like working in the US, Canada, Mexico, throughout Latin America, supporting also like there's elements of like of movements across, there's different organizations that bring together, that Indigenous groups come together to discuss priorities across many different countries as well. So I think just supporting those efforts led by Indigenous communities to come together to say, okay, like what are some of the laws that we want to see? What are our goals? And also, addressing how climate damages from climate change will fall disproportionately on BIPOC communities. So addressing that and trying to hold corporations accountable for that is also, I think, a big element of environmental and climate justice. So as you can see, I'm still figuring out the exact route because I have 2 more years to go in school, but I think very much just looking for an organization that aligns with all of the values and work that I've talked about. And it's great that there's some out there. And then I encourage people, if you don't see an organization that's doing, that's kind of aligning with the values and the work you want to do, coming together with other people and creating an organization. Like I think that for example, for the Law Students for Climate Accountability, we said, okay, there's no data out there about how top law firms are contributing to the climate crisis. Like let's get that data and let's put it out there. And also, I mean, especially good to note that like whenever you're creating an organization, like who are the stakeholders, who does this impact, and making sure those voices are represented, and you're building an organization that is not just going to go and tell people what to do, but rather uplifts community voices and works directly with communities and focuses on those priorities. But I also just wanted to encourage people that if you see a problem out there that's not being solved, you don't have to, if you don't see an organization that's the perfect fit, trying to bring in that innovative side and bring in that, that drive to address issues that people aren't talking about, in whatever field you end up, whatever field you're in. So hope that answers the question, but I'm happy to take more, more questions on that too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking us through that. I definitely think it's interesting to like have to sort of forge your own path in a space that you are trying to find the work that really fulfills your values and the ways in which you're thinking of just like the work and the way you want to approach it. But shifting gears a little bit, and this is more like a general question. Post undergrad, how have you met other people that are similarly passionate as you with like environmental justice, environmentalism, and sustainability? And along with that, just like thinking about yourself and what are some ways you sustain yourself when you're working on such important things, or carving that space for yourself in law school?
Yeah, both great questions. I think something in addition to meeting people through law school and through very like environmental justice focused organizations, always a great way to meet people. I think just also like volunteering and working, like for example, I've started to work with various mutual aid groups in New Haven, and there's a group called the Connecticut Bail Fund, and I've started to go to their trainings. I mean, the pandemic kind of threw a wrench in everything, but so I think it's uniquely difficult to really to get connected with your community in this time. So, but acknowledging that, I think something that I've tried to do is look for what community groups are looking into climate justice, either like, for example, in New Haven, trying to support local groups, as a way to meet people kind of beyond my normal peer group, right? It's like, I feel like we all talk about the Dartmouth bubble, and similarly at Yale, there's like this bubble. And I think breaking that is a really important part of like climate justice and environmental justice as a whole, is building partnerships across these, breaking down these bubbles and barriers that keep us from, working with people in the community who might be older than us, or working like, Yale can be a very white space, and actively breaking that barrier and working with communities in New Haven, and working with BIPOC communities, that we all, we live in New Haven, but we spend so much of our time at Yale. And so I think that's been, I think, a good way to meet other people who are interested in sustainability and maybe have different perspectives on it than I do, have different lived experiences than I do. So I think that's a great way to do it, as well as just a plug for reaching out to alums too. I think a lot of when I was talking to Dahlia and Jasmine before this event, I was telling them how so many things in my life have happened because I've seen a Dartmouth alum doing something and was just set up a call with them. And I plug that alums can be really great about answering cold emails. So I also recommend that as a way to get in touch. But yeah, I think trying to do whatever you can locally and look for intersections between climate justice and racial justice and organizations that are working on food justice and food access. That's another topic and area that I've tried to explore more and have gotten into more since post-grad. But yeah, those are a couple of ways. And then I think things to sustain myself are just, I don't know, finding something I realized at Dartmouth is just having things that you love that aren't about producing something, that aren't about an outcome. It's just solely about the process. And for me, that's things like going on walks and making music. And so those are two things that I feel like sustain me because they're not about, it's just not about the outcome. It's just about the process. And I've, since obviously with the pandemic, it's tough, but as soon as I came to law school, I started meeting other people and I met some other people who like to jam and make music. And we, especially before the pandemic, we got together once a week and just played our instruments and sang for hours. So, on like a personal level, I think finding those things in your life that are just for you and don't have an outcome are really, really important. And and having people you love and care about to do those things with and just to talk to and I tried to never skimp on time that is spent with people that I love and getting to know people. Cause those are the things you remember most of all. It's not an extra 2 hours of reading. It's not what you remember. You remember the people that you spent time with and those experiences.
No, that makes absolute sense. I think a lot of us have been learning the same thing, especially, this past year with everything going remotely, really having to figure out, if school is also in home, what other things can I be doing to make sure I'm sustaining myself and making sure, work isn't all of our lives. But I think I really appreciate all the really great insight you've offered so far. I'm thinking a lot about, what does it mean to navigate a kind of career field and make it work for the people it ought to work for. I'm thinking about how to lean on connections and how to make sure that I'm using my networks and also my resources to be of help to myself and to others in a lot of ways. So we really appreciate everything you've gone over so far. But we now want to open it up to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat or in the question and answer feature at the bottom of Zoom. And we'll, use the next 13 minutes or so to answer any questions folks have. But we'll start with the one that Dolly has already asked, which is, what are some organizations you recommend looking into that's at this intersection between law and environmental justice?
Yeah, great question. I think what's awesome is there are a lot of organizations out there doing this work, a lot of local organizations. And then, like I was explaining, like organizations like Earth Justice that work as partners to local organizations. A couple that come to mind off the top of my head. There's one called Uprose that's doing great environmental justice focused work. One specific one that I was writing a paper about local efforts to ban fossil fuel infrastructure and for environmental justice, and specifically focusing on the health burdens of polluting industries. There's an organization called, it's kind of a long title, so I'm gonna mess it up, but Southside Coalition to Ban Pet Coke, I think it's called. And that's a local group on the south side of Chicago that's working to stop more fossil fuel infrastructure from being built there, especially because the south side of Chicago has experienced such a disproportionate burden of extractive industries in terms of health outcomes, pollution, and just that's another example. I think looking for environmental justice organizations that focus on health is one really great avenue to look down. There's a whole list of other organizations. There's one called Earth Rights That's a legal organization that works to support land rights, climate justice work. And yeah, there's kind of, I think one tip also for finding environmental justice organizations is to go look in a specific region, specific area, because I think that's something that's so strong about environmental justice organizations is grassroots community built organizations. So there is a long list. If you look in a specific area and see, okay, what are people organizing around here? For example, like there's a Stop the Pipeline movement, who's leading the protests and leading the movement here. And I think that's a really good place to start to find grassroots environmental justice organizations. And then I think there's also like Indigenous Environmental Network is a great organization working on Indigenous rights and climate justice. And yeah, those are just a couple that come to mind off the top of my head. But I think just, knowing how to go about searching. And I think just, looking locally to different areas to see who's leading, who's supporting local communities, who's centering the voices of BIPOC communities, who is, what organizations are made up of community members and led by communities. That would be kind of my advice on finding some environmental justice focused organizations. And then, I think in addition, some partners, like looking for organizations that support the goals of environmental justice orgs, looking for partners. Like I think Natural Resources Defense Council has been working really hard on expanding environmental justice. And I think looking to what the big green organizations, which of those organizations are really putting resources towards environmental justice work. So for example, Natural Resources Defense Council has worked with community organizations in Flint to support their lawsuits about the Flint water crisis. So I hope that helps. It's a broad field, and I'll drop my info into the chat in case people have any other questions they want to follow up with. I see another question in the chat, but I'll put that in now while I remember. Because definitely everyone should feel free to reach out to me. I see Rachel posted a question in the chat. Thoughts on environmental justice in the Biden area? I'm pretty optimistic. I think largely I'm optimistic because of the work of BIPOC community organizers putting pressure on the administration. I think acknowledging so much work is being done by BIPOC communities to say, we will not stand for these environmental injustices. We need an administration that is serious about environmental justice. And I think some of the appointees, like appointee to the EPA, has done work in North Carolina, and for example, is very aware of, there's a lot of environmental justice issues in North Carolina with concentrated animal feeding operations and the meat industry. So I think it seems like that he's been putting in place appointees who have a strong environmental justice record and focus on environmental justice. So I think that's one optimistic sign, as well as, like I said, just mobilization of communities to increase pressure on the Biden administration and people in power, partnering and listening to frontline communities. I'm optimistic that, for example, we'll see reform in the EPA for addressing environmental racism, as well as, having the Democratic House and Senate earlier this year. I think it was Kamala Harris and I think Cory Booker might have been a co-sponsor on a new environmental justice legislation, which would basically amend the laws to allow people to be able to sue for environmental injustices and for environmental racism. So I am optimistic. I hope they make it a priority, and I think that's kind of on all of us as students with privilege of having gone to Dartmouth and having access to these networks to kind of put the feet to the fire and put the pressure on there to focus on environmental justice. So I hope we all go out and work on that. That's definitely a goal for me this year, is to, in any way I can, support seeing meaningful change at the federal level on environmental justice. I see
That's
Evelyn.
awesome. Oh yeah, well, I was just gonna read it, but yeah, we're going to the same place. So Evelyn asked, what has been your favorite part of working with law students for climate accountability so far? And could you remind us quickly what the organization does is also?
Yeah, sure. I see I can send a message to all. I'll do a little website, because actually I did a little web design for this. It's a very scrappy organization. So I was like, oh, I have no web design skills. I'll just figure out how to use Squarespace. That's something I'll do this weekend. Yeah, so I think one of my favorite parts about it has just been, well, I feel like just working with some really awesome peers and meeting people at different law students across the country has been one of my favorite parts. Like, just, I feel like it all started with an idea, like a couple of classmates at Yale saying, there's all this pressure on recruiting to go to work at a big law firm. And, there's a lot of reasons for doing it. And, and especially like for low income students and, students that have to like supporting their families and paying off debts, like big law firms pay a lot of money. But so, there's a lot of like really strong pressures and pressures that fall disproportionately on different people. Like, there's, different intersections of different layers of privilege there. And so I think it started out with a group of students saying like, wow, we know that law firms are doing a lot of work to support the fossil fuel industry, but there's no database out there, and there isn't really like a lot of student organizing going on around that to say like law firms shouldn't be contributing to the climate crisis, or at the very least, students should know like which law firms are doing how much work to exacerbate the climate crisis and to support fossil fuel industry. So I think, yeah, my favorite part has been kind of having this idea with a group of other Yale students, and then just saying, all right, like we're gonna start doing this, and we want to also just like we really want to bring other people in. I think that's also kind of where we're at in the organization, as well as just reaching out to different law schools and working with people with just seeing how much energy there is around climate organizing among law students. I think has been something that's given me a lot of hope this year, or this past in 2020, which was, I know for many a really, really, really tough year on so many levels. So I think seeing that energy around climate organizing has been one of my favorite parts, as well as it's really cool to just, I don't know, to see like an area where there isn't information out there and where there's a lack of transparency, and then put your hard work in to make it, make that information available, and to kind of put the feet to the fire of large law firms that, they can't kind of hide behind the fact that there wasn't, they used to be able to, there wasn't information out there. So no one kind of knew what they were doing. But then, so it was really exciting to compile that. And yeah, to start to also have law firms start to be more receptive to it and say like, okay, like if we want to keep recruiting students, like we need to start thinking about long-term what our role is in the climate crisis. So yeah, I think it's just working with great people and, just, yeah, seeing a project all the way through from like very small idea to a student movement has been really, really awesome. Yeah, it's been a great experience, and a lot of hard work, but a great experience with all the people.
Awesome. I think that's really interesting to really see in what ways, even as a student, you can really, try to have some pull and kind of leave your mark on what the law field does and what the industry is able to do, and kind of accountability, even for the folks who are supposed to do, accountability work. So that's really wonderful. I think we'll take this one final question we got, which is, was it difficult to apply to law school / return to school after having gone to work for a few years after undergrad?
Yeah, this is a great question too. And definitely, please, y'all have my email now. Please email me if you have law school questions, because I think it's a tough process. And I think also it's not the most transparent process in the world. Like I had no idea what I was doing. And I asked a couple, I knew a couple of Dartmouth 15s who had gone to law school. So I just reached out to them and asked them questions. So please consider me a resource if you're thinking of applying. And then, yeah, I actually, my experience was I was really excited to go back to school because I think spending 2 years out was a good choice for me because I feel like it gave, it was like work experience as well as getting to work with communities in Mexico. And I think it really grounded me in what I wanted to get out of law school and how, like, I think it's helped me kind of keep on my path of doing public interest, environmental law, Indigenous rights work. the fact that I'd spent some time working before going to law school. And I think in terms of the application process, I think, yeah, I'm happy to chat anytime at length. But I think finding time to take the LSAT is always tough, especially, we're working a full-time job and studying for that entrance test was definitely tough. But I think a great part of the process is getting to for example, you write a personal statement. And I actually found it really useful to reflect on, why am I even applying to law school? Like, what do I really hope to get out of it? So I think there's both difficulties of the process as well as, I think there's fundamental unfairness in the sense of you can pay for LSAT prep course, it's like some people can't afford LSAT prep courses. I studied on my own, I wasn't making a lot of money after law school, studied on my own kind of thing. But, so I don't want to, I won't sugarcoat that it can be a difficult process, but I also think for me, the application process was really helpful in figuring out, kind of just checking in with myself about why I wanted to pursue law and policy. And I think there's a lot of other factors that go into it too, and thinking about what school you want to go to and such. But I think, it's both a tough process to apply, but also I found it a good time to reflect. But truly happy to serve as a resource for anyone who's looking at applying to law school or wants to talk about it more. And because again, like all of the fantastic questions this evening, it's a question that I could, spend quite some time going through. But I hope that answers the question for the most part.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of us haven't always been thinking about that. What are the trade-offs between going straight through undergrad to grad school versus, getting that really valuable experience in between and getting more rooted in why you want to do the work that you do before you put yourself on that path. So I definitely really appreciate hearing from you. And I'm not even pre-law, so I think definitely pretty applicable. But yes, we definitely ended perfectly on time. Some of us have class in 30 minutes, but we really, really appreciate you, Alisa. This has been a really, really wonderful conversation. I'm sure participants got a lot out of it, just as I did. It's really great to be able to hear folks who are, charting their path in environmental justice and in, the path to fighting climate change before it's too late for all of us. I think a lot of us are figuring out what our place will be in this, larger fight. And so I really appreciate hearing from you today about what that's looked like. But if either of you have any final thoughts?
No, just thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. And again, shout out to the organizers and Dahlia, Rachel, Jasmine, and also, I just want to send just a sense of, it's great to see students out there interested in climate and environmental justice, and just finding a way to be a part of it, whatever your specific niche becomes in the movement. Just that it's a lot of different people working on different things in their daily lives that all come together. Thanks again for having me, and it's been a pleasure to talk with everyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone who came tonight and watched this. Again, this will be posted to the Sustainability Office's website soon come within the next few days or weeks. And Alisa's email is also in the chat for anyone who hasn't had a chance to get it. And she is happy to talk to folks about any of the things that we've talked about tonight. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.